So if we look at the Chinese in terms of scholar stones, they have a specific aesthetic which is radically different than the Japanese. The Japanese use a mimetic aesthetic, otherwise something that mimics things in nature, but the Chinese are more sculptural stones, and they don't mind carving their stones at all, right? But they started in the Tang Dynasty with natural rare stones were collected and displayed, but they were primarily garden stones. Some of the stones that were found were 8, 12, 16 feet tall. But over the years, as you see through the Song Dynasty and forward, they began to collect stones to appreciate them in the home, especially the literati, putting it on their desks, so they were much smaller stones. Okay. They loved landscape because they were very passionate about rivers and mountains. If you've looked at any of the the Chinese scrolls, they almost always involve mountains, rivers, and people. Okay. This particular stone is actually a Japanese stone. It's a Furuya stone, but stones had back then immense value. In fact, it's known that in China, people often traded a stone for a home. That's a commitment. This particular stone was sold at Sotheby's in Hong Kong about 3 years ago for $36,000. Okay, so let's look at their stones for a minute. How would you describe these? Grotesque? It's a good word. What else? Say it again. Alien? Okay. Skeletal? Good. Very sculptural, right? Yes. These are actually real. Many of the stones today that they call Lingby stones are carved. That bothers some people it doesn't bother. Let's look at the next stone. What do you think of this stone? Looks like lava, okay. What do you think it might be used for? How about a brush rest? A brush rest that you lay your brush down as you're doing calligraphy. It's a really beautiful stone. The other thing you'll notice, how is that Daiza different than the Japanese make or we make in the US? Yes, what else? It's very, it's very ornate, right? We rarely see that with Japanese stones. But does it fit this particular stone to you? It does. It's an excellent point, Paul. That's exactly right. And in fact, that is, to me, what helps to make this stone in terms of its overall beauty, is that they really integrate well together. The Japanese will say, don't let the Daiza outshine the stone. So you have to be careful in terms of color. That's when we typically have darker colors, etc. Okay? The other additional thing that really changes between the Chinese and the Japanese is shown in this photograph. What do you see? Yes, 3 stones. How often in a Japanese display do you see more than 1 stone? Very rare. Occasionally, if there's sagari-ishis or people stones, you'll see those, sometimes with multiple stones, but it's very rare to have more than 1 stone. Okay? One more. So, a lot of Japanese art that they follow actually came from China, which is the same for Suiseki. They speculate that it came from China in the Asuka period, which is around 592 to 710 AD. The earliest physical evidence of appreciation was in the Kamakura period of 1185 to 1333. There was a specific book that was written. So it means that it goes back a very long way. However, the way they viewed stones was typically in a tray with a tree or a plant. Was rarely that it was a stone by itself. That came much later in Japanese history. Let's just go ahead. Bonsai, which is the art of stones with sand drawings. Have you seen those before? They're quite beautiful. Hideko was really good at doing this. And there was an early, you'll see it in 1309, there was a scroll of a scene in a Japanese garden where there was a rock in a tray. And that's one of the earliest documentation of stones being used in Japan for art. Okay. I'm going to skip most of this text, but go to the one that's highlighted. Shirin, who was 1278 to 1347, was one of the earliest people that had stone appreciation in Japanese history. But one of the things that he was concentrating on, he focuses entirely on viewing experience and the imaginative process behind it. That kind of captures this presentation tonight. The Japanese use a mimetic aesthetic, but they depend upon you to finish the scene. So if you see a stone like we have on this table, it's a nice stone. To look at the stone and to categorize it by saying, well, it's smooth, it's dark, and talk about its texture, etc. That's the beginning of viewing that stone. But how would you see that stone? Anyone? So here's what I find that happens just like in bonsai. Somebody will show a tree, and what do people typically do? See, my friends would talk about what's wrong with my tree. Okay. They would never ask me, what am I trying to do with it? But they would show me what's wrong. With stones, we kind of do the same thing at times. The Japanese aesthetic is what's your imagination, what is it telling you when you look at this stone? What's around it? What's on it? That is extremely important for Suiseki. Yes. So in the Muromachi period, the culture had developed around bonsai, which is now a stone in a tray, but it could be with something else like a tree. But they began to consider them objects of contemplation and of great value for display in tea rooms or other interior spaces. And in that particular period, stones from China were highly valued. Anyone seen this stone before? Yeah, super famous, right? One of the unusual things about this stone is it's displayed in white quartz. Today in Japan, that would be an absolute no-no because white represents death. But this is the only way you will ever see this stone displayed. This is a stone that was passed down from somewhere between 1288 and 1339. So this stone is super old. It's called the Bridge of Floating Dreams. Another Chinese stone, perhaps my absolute favorite, is Su no Matsuyama, or the Eternal Pine Mountain. What's unusual about this display? Say it again. It is. It's a ceramic plate. No water, no sand. That's also very unusual, but this is the only way this stone is ever displayed. And it's been displayed like this for hundreds of years. It was in the JSC exhibition about 5 years ago. Okay, so in the Edo period, bonsai and kaiseki, otherwise known as strange stones, were embraced by the literati, who came from a variety of backgrounds, but who in common were inspired by art from Japan. One of those people was Rai Sanyo. We're going to show you a couple of his stones. He was very wealthy. He was known as literati, so he was very educated. And I wish I could do what he did, which is he hired people to go out and find stones for him. And they would bring it back to his home and he would reject or keep. So let's go to the next page. This is probably the most famous Tsugateishi, or person stone in the world. This stone is over 300 years old. It's from the Kamigawa River, and it's absolutely spectacular. What do you notice about its daisa? Weird? Okay, that's a good word. Looks like driftwood? Yes. So what did the person who paired these together, what do you think he was trying to express to us? Say it again. Hope? Okay. What about the physicality of where this stone is standing? It represents a person. What are they standing on? Okay, good. Yeah, so it's not smooth and flat, right? It's not like a slab or a jita, but it's very organic. It looks like it's standing outside somewhere, whether it's on a piece of wood or in leaves, but it's a very good pairing. Next. This is another Raisanyo stone as well, very famous. This stone is only 8.5 centimeters. So we're talking about this wide, but it is a natural hut stone. Any of you own hut stones? Real or both? Yeah. So one of the most manufactured stone in Japan today is still hut stones. Why? Because people love them. So to find a natural hut stone is very rare. Okay. Yes. In fact, people will say, well, no, the Japanese only use natural stones. Go back and look in any of the magazines or books in the 1960s in Japan, and 2/3 of all ads are on stone altering tools. Chisels, drills, they manufacture stones all the time. In fact, there's even a category for manufactured stones. Okay? So in 1910, the first issue of Kosekishi was published, and it was the first Japanese periodical dedicated to the appreciation of stones. Another really confusing point, do any of you belong also to Aiseki Kai in Los Angeles? Okay, if you don't, go to their website. I'll send a link to Bob. Will, the guy that's on the board of the Nippon Suiseki Association, wrote this seminal article on the history of Suiseki. It's 12 pages long. It's the best I've ever read about how things developed. So 2 things you can take with you. There is no uniform standard in Japan when it comes to Suiseki. I don't care what they tell you. There is none. There are some rules that people adhere to, but the clubs are different. If you go to the JSE, they have a fairly strict set of rules that they judge by. But if you go to the guy who runs a Seki magazine in Japan, they have about 8,000 subscribers. Their rules are completely different. Okay. So, but they clearly defined in 1910 these 6 categories of stones: kaiseki, tenseki, suiseki, bonseki, and tenenkaiseki. You're going to hear intermix things like bonseki, suiseki. You'll hear things like tenseki. And they had a meeting in 1910, but they also changed through 1930s and 40s and 50s. You'll see in Covella's book, he talks about that they can only be natural uncut stones for suiseki. Is that true? Absolutely not. Those 2 stones that you saw that were from China, those were both worked, but they're still highly valued. Sure. Yes.
Was on the Bridge of Dreams, it was in white, and we say that that's associated with death. Was that purposeful, like to show maybe the bridge between life and death?
A great question. Great question. In this particular case, it wasn't. That white was to be clouds. So the illustration was it's a large mountain, but the only thing you're seeing is the top of that mountain. And because that white was representative of clouds surrounding the mountain. In the 1960s and 70s, they started saying don't use white material because of death. But yet, Hideko, do you know Hideko at all? Wonderful, right? She's 94 years old now. Her presentation 2 years ago was 2 stones from Greece on white sand, but it was in the show. Rules are made to be broken. Okay. That's okay. I think we're one more over. There we go. So this definition, Suiseki refers to a single natural stone that has the power to suggest something in nature far greater than itself. That's what a lot of the books say. I would just ask you to please delete the word natural, because natural has a lot of meanings. So is this stone, beautiful stone, by the way, is this natural? It's been cut. Yes, but yes, the bottoms have been cut. So in some circles, the Covello book in particular would say, this is no longer Suiseki because the stone's have been modified. Okay? My suggestion is it was modified for a reason. Michelangelo modified marble, but it was still art, right? My mentor, Mas Nakajima, we would have knockdown, drag out arguments because he was saying, no, this isn't modified. I just cut it to make it look better. So, well, Mas, it's still modified, right? So it's your tolerance for what modifications are okay. But Suiseki primarily in the early days were landscape stones, which this is a part of. But even that began to develop and change. Have you heard in this country in Suiseki stone clubs that in Japan they only have black, gray stones? If it isn't those 2 colors, it's not Suiseki. Yet I can pull you a book from the 1960s where there's a Japanese term for 5-color stones. Now, why do you think that some people in Japan only like black or gray stones? It's really simple. Because that's the preponderance of what you find in Japan. Now, there is an akadama stone, which is bright red, but it's very hard and it tends to have to be worked to be made into Suiseki, but color is okay. Do you guys know Felix Rivera at all? Felix ran the California Suiseki Club. He would not go to Black Butte Lake to collect because the stones were colorful. Hey, that's his choice. Okay. So we're not going to go through this, but just to show you from time, they had Bonseki, that should be Bonsan, that's a typo by me, then Bonkai, which are historical stones. They had Roseki, Kaiseki, Chinseki, these are more modified, beautiful stones. There was Bonsai, and then you go to landscape stones, eventually to Suiseki. So what is this little graph representing? Evolution, great word. There was no standard. Standards changed. But yet, we in America especially have taken some view of what somebody told us was happening in Japan, and we've turned that into hard and fast rules. Rules and art tend not to go along too well together, okay? All right, so I would say that most people view Suiseki through classification. So what would that be? Shape, quality of material, color, surface texture, and age. Now, why do most people judge stones by classification? What do you think? It's the way our brains work. That's true. Because it's easy. It's easy to classify. So take this stone, beautiful stone. How would you classify it based upon those 5 criteria? Okay, what's its shape? Vertical, right? Okay. What about the quality of the material? See, quality is already suspect. What does quality mean? How do you define quality? Well, Moss would have defined it as it's hard material. So he would look at a Ma value. How hard is it? Can it be scratched? What do you think? Is it good material? Absolutely good material. What's the color? Yeah. What's the main colors? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's good, right? What about surface texture? It is, isn't it? And Paul, why is that? What is it about the texture that you really like?
It's when you look at it, it's almost like layers of depth of texture.
That's a great way to describe it. Some people paint that way. They paint in layers, right? This stone looks like, in some regards, a painting. It's a very good stone. Yes. That's a good sign for a stone, isn't it? Unless it's yours and you don't want people touching it. What about the age? Does it look old? Yes. In some circles, yes. Sure. The question was, if it's petrified wood, is it stone? It's a great question. My friend has displayed petrified wood at the show in Japan, and he got through the judging criteria, so I think yes. Anyway, beautiful stone. So why is classification so easy to do, but then we stop at classification when viewing that stone? Why is that? Sure. Why do most of us stop at classification when viewing a Suiseki? We'll do these 5 things mentally. We'll look at the shape, the quality of the material, the color, the texture, and the age, but then we don't go beyond that. We stop at classification. Give that man a cigar if you smoke. Paul's response was lack of imagination. And see, here's the rub. Mimetic aesthetic depends upon you as a viewer finishing the scene, your imagination, in your head with any of these stones on these tables. So classification is a good place to start. Classify it. Shape. Oval. Okay. What else? Okay. What else? Smooth. Okay. Excellent. That would be texture. What about quality of material? There are serpentine that's harder, right? But this is still good serpentine. What about color? Yeah, so green with light green, the streaks. How would you think about displaying this? You could be vertical, sure. What about in a suiban where it's lying down? Okay. Would you want to build patina on this stone? Ooh, that's a tough question. Because there's real beauty in this lightness. It's not shiny. Yeah, right? But now let's go to the next question. So we've defined it by category, but what is it? What do you imagine when you see this? What scene comes to life? Okay, so what if I took two small bronze birds and placed them on the stone? Would that change how you see it? Would it suddenly become a coastal stone or a river stone? Right, so what we accompany it with can also change our imagination of what we see. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes,
And you're talking about quality.
yes.
What are the criteria that determine the quality?
Quality. I would say that the majority of people would say hardness. A couple of club members from our club in San Francisco would take a penknife out and see if they could scratch the stone. Serpentine is very difficult to scratch. Color, almost everything that was on that list to some degree is for quality. The hardest thing for me was determining what Moss would reject when I took it to him. In fact, I'm going to do a short plug. This book, Suiseki Stories, I just released. It's got 80 stories of stones from all over the world, from people who collect like you and I. And the lead story is me collecting with Moss at Black Butte. And I found a stone and I look at it and I look at it for 10 minutes. I put it back down on the ground. Stupidity. I picked it back up, said, well, I can only be yelled at, so I put it in my backpack. Well, at lunch, we would eat, but then we would share what we found that day. So I wait till the very end and finally hand it to Moss to see what he's going to say. Have you ever been in church when it gets really quiet and you wonder what's going on? Well, Moss didn't say anything for about 5 to 7 minutes. He just kept turning the stone over and over and over again. He finally looked at me and said, Sam, I'll give you every stone I have in my truck for this stone. And I knew he had 18 stones in his truck from that morning. What was he expressing? Quality. Rarity, absolutely. It looks like a 17th century teacup. So quality can be color, hardness, shape. But I will say this, the thing that's most important to me is how do I react to it in my heart? What does it remind me of? Okay. Yes.
I wasn't sure if I heard you correctly, but did you say change the patina?
Yes.
Is that allowed?
Are work stones allowed? So the Japanese, they change patina all the time, right? Ellen, how do they change it? The nose. Yeah, so they'll tell you that the way that they add patina is that you rub the stone on your face by your nose. And in 40 years, you might have some patina. What they don't tell you is, yeah, they'll use something like Renaissance wax to give it a little bit of a shine. It's up to you. Just don't represent it as something that it's not. So if you've done that, just admit it. Now, it might not get into certain shows, but I can guarantee you this, 20 to 25% or more of the stones of Japan, people have worked on the patina and it's not rubbing it on their nose.
One thing you didn't mention in your classification that seems really important to a lot of collectors I've known is origin of the stone.
Origin?
And a lot of people, it seems very important to know where the stone came from.
It is. Well, and Jim Greaves, how many of you know Jim? So Jim and I are good buddies, and we've had many knockdown dragouts over provenance. He doesn't value provenance at all. I'm sorry, I'm a sucker for provenance, right? I like the fact that the stone has a history. So I think of the similar, you may value greatly location. Some people do, some people don't. But in terms of classifying it, they tend not to use location, even though you'll never see a stone in Japan where they don't declare where the stone is from. That's more of a marketing thing, because 80 to 85% of all the stones that are said are from the Setagawa and Kamigawa have never seen those two rivers, but they sell for a lot more money. Okay, so since mid-20th century, stones have sort of gotten tighter in the classification. Baiseki, beautiful stones, okay? Shinseki, rare, strange, or extraordinary. And then what we're talking about, Suiseki, suggestive of something in nature. Okay? Let's go next. So Baiseki refers mainly to stones which have been heavily polished and are appreciated for their color above all else. What's a good representation of that in Japan? Chrysanthemum stones. Right? How many of you have seen, especially from China, but Japan as well, they're highly polished. It brings out the flower. But is it Suiseki? You almost never see it in a Japanese show. Okay? They sell a lot of them, but they're not in the show. The colors tend to be bright and explicit, and patterns may emerge in the stone surface after polishing. Again, chrysanthemum stones. Patterns tend to be abstract rather than flowers, birds, or other natural phenomena. However, I'm not going to walk all the way down because of the camera, but there's a stone that has a stripe running through it. Okay. You'll see often stones that have a circle on it. That's fairly common on the eel you'll find. So is that Baiseki or Suiseki? Because Suiseki has a classification called monoishi, pattern stones. So once again, the rule isn't hard and fast, it's a little loose. You could call it a Baiseki, but some would call it a Suiseki, okay? I know it's confusing, right? Let's go to the next slide. Shinseki, rare, strange, or extraordinary. These tend to be fossils or mineral specimens. I can't recall ever seeing one at the JSC or the Mahan 10, ever. They're beautiful. I have a bunch of them at home, but they're not really falling into the classification of Suiseki. It could. There's a lot of discussion, because I know you asked about it earlier. Is petrified wood stone from a geological perspective? Yes, it absolutely is. So now I think you have to go to the other categories. What's its texture like? What's its color? In the Japanese sense, is it a mimetic stone? Does it represent something in nature? Whereas in Shinseki, it doesn't have to represent anything in nature at all, right? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Jump down to this highlight. Baiseki and Shinseki are appreciated for what they are. Suiseki is appreciated for what it suggests. If you just take that home tonight, that's the only thing that's important to take with you. Okay, it goes back to the imagination again. What does it suggest? I guarantee you 70 or 80% of the people who would have seen this on the Eel River would have done what? Walk right on by, right? The one thing I was always impressed with Moss is he never picked up a stone that he didn't spend at least 5 minutes looking at it, turning it in every direction. The other thing that he did out of respect is if he rejected the stone, how many of you just take it and... I did that once. And I got a dad lecture that you put it back very gently, be respectful. But Ellen, a lot of people will walk past this. It's a good stone, right? It's important. Yes. Yes, sir. Good. Yes.
Seems to me that a Suiseki stone could be in all three categories.
It's potentially could.
Because I have some that definitely resemble something, but are beautiful even if on their own, and somewhat rare.
That's right. One of the greatest examples of this is the chrysanthemum stone that's viewed as a Noah player on stage. It's got a hinoki cypress piece of wood that it resides on a little stand, and it looks like a character. If you hold it out, it looks like the robe is flowing down, and it's a chrysanthemum stone. It's rare, it's unusual, it's been a little polished, so it can fit. But where does it really belong? In that particular case, it belongs in Suiseki, right? Yeah. Okay. But very good point. So remember again, Baiseki, Chenseki appreciated for what they are, Suiseki appreciated for what it suggests. I'm going to blow past this. You can go to the NSA website. This is a generic view of classifications. You'll notice that even the NSA starts out with viewing stones. And Suiseki falls under viewing stones. Some of us would puke over that, but anyway. And then they divide it into landscape, figure, and pattern stones. And under landscape, both land-based and water-based, showing these other various categories. And then Baiseki and Chenseki are still under viewing stones. So in a way, what's your first name again? Alan. In a way, you're absolutely correct. You could have something that crosses all three of these boundaries. Okay? All right, so let's spend a little bit of time, and Bob, tell me when we need to break. But we can start. Let's look at looking at Suiseki through a Japanese aesthetic, okay? We're only going to go a little bit of depth on this, but there's 4 or 5 things that we want to talk about because they're typically the most important inside of a Japanese aesthetic. One big difference between, well, let me ask you the question first. Do Americans have an artistic aesthetic? What do you think? Do we? Do we agree upon it? The big difference between our aesthetic is it's philosophical. The Japanese aesthetic is a part of who they are. And in fact, when you see some terms like wabi-sabi, that's a very difficult term to translate into English, but they have difficulty as well with it. But they know it when they see it. It's just a part of who they are and a part of their internal aesthetic. Okay, so my first question to you is, why do you collect stone? How about a couple of people responding? Why do you collect? Oh, I love that word. They are absolutely beautiful, right? And what may be beautiful for you may not be for me, but with the right attitude, I still appreciate that it's beautiful for you. What else? Oh, absolutely, right? Being out on a river is like fly fishing. I can stand in a river all day and not catch anything, but be happy as a clam. Say it again. Combine the two. Yes, isn't that the truth? But why else do we collect? There's another one that I think is really important. Yes. Preserve is good. I like that. Yes. Say it again. There is, but share it with others. There's nothing like, my wife went collecting with me twice. Anybody get the idea she didn't go back again? And my wife is Japanese from Okinawa, but I still enjoy and thrill in bringing home what I have found to show it to her. Because frankly, she has a better eye than I do. So I love getting her feedback. So then what lens do we view these stones through? This is the whole crux of tonight. I love that answer. Do you know the way that I determine whether I want to keep a stone or not? If I'm not quite sure. You can always get help. I put it on a garden bench. And if in a few weeks I don't see it anymore, stone goes back to the river. But if I see that stone every time I walk past it, it's communicating to me. There's something about it I really like. I like that too, absolutely. It should bring you joy. And it doesn't have to bring everybody else joy, as long as it brings it to you. But now, what lens do you use to view those stones with? Okay, that's good. Good. That's using an imagination. Is classification one way that we could view them? But what's the downside to classification? You do not use your imagination. That's 100% correct. So let's go next. All right. Is it classification or an evaluative critique of the stone, or is it understanding and experiencing its beauty through an established aesthetic? How do you define beauty? Good luck. It is often exactly that. Beauty is difficult, but you know it when you see it, right? But how does different cultures impact our view of beauty? Take Chinese stones and Japanese stones. What's fundamentally different? One is very ornate, very sculptural. What about Japanese Suiseki? Very natural, right? Mountains, waterfalls, pools, people, objects. So the concept of beauty is both complex and culturally influenced. So there are at least 4 or 5 ways we could view these. We could view it through a Western aesthetic, a Chinese aesthetic, a Japanese aesthetic, or what I think most of us do is no aesthetic at all. We look at classification and we stop, which is fine. But that's not Suiseki. Suiseki is when you get your imagination involved. And we'll talk more about that. You could say so. But you go back to Western aesthetic for a moment. The difficulty is, how many of them are there? See, at least the Japanese have said, we're using a mimetic aesthetic. It has to be something that mimics something in nature. That's why you typically will not see sculptural stones, because you won't find that typically in nature. That's a good question. Okay, let's go next. So, this is a key question that I would ask you, is can you truly understand and appreciate Japanese Suiseki without a general understanding of Japanese aesthetic? Right, not totally. So what does that tell us we should do? If we want to practice Suiseki, yes. What about if you practice viewing stones? That'd be a great way to describe it. But let's say that you viewed this through that lens, and let's say this was a round stone, single color, nothing on it. Would that fit into Suiseki? It wouldn't, because it doesn't meet the Japanese aesthetic. Okay, that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Okay. So what is aesthetic? It's a branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of art, beauty and taste, with the creation and appreciation of beauty. Good definition. Next. So Human 1757 said, beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. Doesn't that sound like it's a Japanese person talking? Right? It does. I think so. Listen, I do an experiment with people that take one of my courses. They come to the house. We wait until about a half an hour before sunset. We put a stone out next to a window so the light can change, and they can't say anything for 30 minutes. And they have to watch the effect that the sunlight dimming has on viewing that stone. What do you think 90% of people do within the first 5 minutes? They got to pull the phone out because they can't sit still for 5 minutes. I really challenge you to do this at home because it will change your view of how you look at stones. Light has a tremendous impact on stones. That's why showing stones in a museum setting is extraordinarily difficult. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So Kant concedes that the taste is fundamentally subjective, that every judgment of beauty is based on a personal experience, and that such judgments vary from person to person. It also varies from culture to culture. Like I thought putting my stone that I thought was beautiful in a suiban with white sand was just awesome. Until Moss looked at it and said, "What are you doing?" Right? Because to him it represented death. Well, that was his Japanese culture. It wasn't mine. But I still don't do it. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So an aesthetic, a set of principles underlying and guiding the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. I used to work many, many years ago for Bill Gates. And one of the things we were doing is building an image archive. We started when I was there at about 3 million images. We ended up with about 55 million images. And one of them was J.D. Barnes's collection. J.D. Barnes was an impressionist art collector in the 1920s. And he collected, well, today his collections were right around $6 billion. He set them up in his home. He invited all of his friends in. And what do you think happened? They all laughed because they were used to more like Victorian art. They just thought, why did you waste all your money on buying these Monets and Renoirs and all that stuff, right? He got so angry, he kicked everybody out of his house, would not let them ever come in and see his art again. And one of the provisions in his will was that if the collection was ever acquired or displayed, it could only be displayed as it was exactly displayed in his home. So we got permission to go in and photograph all of his artwork, to create a CD-ROM called A Passion for Art. But we had to shoot everything in place, with the furniture, the accoutrements, with it. Yes, it is. In fact, it wasn't in Philadelphia, and that was another rule that he had about his collection, but the board recently moved it to Philadelphia because they said there'd be more people. Anyway, let's go next. Okay, Nicholas Pappas. He said the core concepts of aesthetic and beauty are beauty, imitation, inspiration. What does that sound like? Whose aesthetic is that? Sounds like the Japanese again, doesn't it? Right? Human can't, defining a standard in even one culture is difficult, if not impossible. Now consider the attempt to define beauty across cultures, where often words in one language have no direct correlation to a word or phrase in another language. But yet, how often do we see a beautiful stone, whether it's from America or Japan, but we still think that it's a beautiful stone? Why is that? Because the people who study aesthetics really say beauty is truth. So if it's beautiful, it's beautiful. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Yep. I think we can skip this. We've talked about that a little bit. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go back. I want to bring out one point. So in Sartwell's article, he talks about among the qualities that can be derived from the assumption of traditional Japanese aesthetic, Donald Keene has distinguished suggestion, irregularity, simplicity, and perishability. Do we think that's the Western aesthetic? Not at all. In fact, it's the opposite. We appreciate proportion, coherency, harmony, symmetry, which in fact is almost the opposite of a Japanese aesthetic. Okay. So once again, we have to kind of think about our lens and how we're looking at things as it relates to Suiseki. Okay. We talked about language. Okay. So in Donald Rich's book, it's actually a pretty good book to read on Japanese aesthetic. He says, traditional Japanese aesthetic still lacks a definition. There were and are, however, plenty of terms in Japanese, such as wabi, sabi, aware, and more, but these all refer to qualities, otherwise to parts of an assumed unnamed whole. It's a lot of words. What is he really trying to say? It goes back to aesthetic for the Japanese people is built in. It's what they live in. Now, they can define core components of it, but I've never read a full definition of Japanese aesthetic that wasn't these terms. Okay. All right. Japanese arts and aesthetics, partly because Japanese arts value the indirect and implicit, they place a heavy demand on the reader or viewer to complete the work, as it were, and to emphasize in order to understand. I think this is the most difficult thing for most of us in trying to view Suiseki, because again, it asks us to complete the view. So if we're looking at that beautiful stone on the stand, if we stop with classification, didn't we stop too soon? Right? Because it's saying the Japanese aesthetic places a heavy demand upon us, the viewer, to complete the work. Okay? So you've got to use your imagination. Next. All right, nature is seen as a dynamic whole that is to be admired and appreciated. This appreciation of nature has been fundamental to many Japanese aesthetic ideals or arts and other cultural elements. Well, Suiseki is really formed around the idea of a mimetic aesthetic. That's why sculptural stones from China don't really fit into Suiseki per se. Yes. Mimetic? Yeah, it means it mimics. So if we look at that stone again on the table, what does that mimic? It's a mountain, right? Yeah. So they want Suiseki stones to mimic something in nature. Okay. I'm going to buzz through this. You guys can look these things up, but the 7 aesthetic principles of Zen, I am not a Zen follower, but I like the definitions, is asymmetry, irregularity, simplicity, weathered, without pretense, natural, subtly, profound grace, I couldn't say it, not obvious, unbounded by convention and free and tranquility. How many of you like quiet stones? What do you like about quiet stones? Yeah. What's one of the ways that you can, in a display, create the sense of tranquility? desolation. So Ellen has a stone and a suiban, right? Which is a very quiet stone. Why is that? It's the one in the suiban down here. Ella, why? Okay. Okay. And what else, though, gives it that feeling of desolation or loneliness or tranquility?
Space.
Negative space around it. In fact, if you want it to even feel more desolate, you can even use a larger suiban. But there are some rules there too that you can't go beyond. It can't be too big. But that sense of openness around it will give you that feeling of desolation or tranquility. Yeah. Could you use this stone to try to drive tranquility? Would it be more difficult? It would be. Because one thing that about her stone was it's very smooth. That's helpful. Okay. That's a very rough stone, but you could still do it with a suiban with a lot of negative space around it.
You might have just done this kind of, but the difference between quiet and what's the opposite? Busy?
Yes,
So are you saying that's last stone would be considered busy?
it could be. Yes. It's got a lot of texture, a lot of movement. Some people would call it movement rather than busyness. But busyness is it. Busyness is not all bad, but it's certainly a different look and feel to the stone that's in the suiban, right? Okay. Yes.
Oh, I was just saying, this stone for me has a sense of dynamism,
It does.
and that is quiet,
Yeah.
still. Yeah.
And we'll see in a minute. And the definition of wabi-sabi, a lot of people think that means that a wabi-sabi stone is quiet. That's not exactly true. It can be. But wabi-sabi can also be very dynamic or very strong. That's a strong stone that you have, right? It emits in that way. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, you're good. So further defining the Japanese aesthetic is miyabi, right? It's one of the oldest of the traditional Japanese aesthetic ideals through perhaps not as prevalent as iki or wabi-sabi. In modern Japanese word usually is translated as elegant. If you've ever been to Japan and seen the Golden Temple, that exudes elegance. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Does this stone exude miyabi? Does this stone exude the concept of miyabi? Elegant. Why? Okay, that's good. What else? It's actually not. It's natural. It's a Kamigawa stone. If you ever come to our house, I'll show it to you. Yep. Somebody said something else. Okay. Why does it look relaxed to you? That's a good definition.
I don't know. It just doesn't appear to be uptight.
I mean, even though there are a lot of peaks, it's a very calm stone. Right? Now, is that impacted in how it's displayed? Yes. So this is Karama sand. Karama is a stone from the Karama River that they make into Suiseki sand. This is typically what you would see displayed in Japan. It's this little richer brown that we typically have in the US. The other thing is what that container is. Yeah, it's a bronze copper doban made by Harada Hoon, who was the most famous doban maker in Japan. And it's multicolored, it's sort of copperish red and greens, but it also has a very calming effect. So when you display, you might have a quiet stone, but if you want to continue that feeling of tranquility, how you place it has got to couple with that feeling as well. Okay. What about the next stone? Is it elegant? Why? Good words. Okay. Anybody else think that? Yeah, there's a lot of movement, but is that a peaceful stone? Say it again. It looks violent. Yeah. It's a very powerful stone, but it doesn't give me a sense of tranquility. It's not a stone that I would want in a quiet time to be looking at, right? Let's go to the next page. Another term is shibui, right? And that basically is defined as it's simple, subtle, and unobtrusive in its beauty. You see a lot of teacups defined that way, especially raku old teacups. So it's not a great picture, but what is it about that teacup that's appealing? Does simple mean plain? Not at all, right? But it is subtle. And it's unobtrusive. It doesn't stand out. It's not bright red. You rarely see teacups from a tea room having vibrant colors, but you do see flowers in a tea room with very vibrant colors. Okay. What about this stone? This is a Kurama stone, by the way. Yeah. Why? Very simple, right? Beautiful. It's almost one texture of color, right? There's a little bit of variance in the brown. This was owned by Mr. Kasahara. He was the president of the Nippon Suiseki Association for a number of years. And this was his personal stone that year that was in the show. And now a pastor buddy of mine in Wyoming owns that stone. And this photograph doesn't do it justice. It's an absolutely staggeringly beautiful stone. Okay. What about this? What do you think? Cute? The Danseki, it's natural. The color has not been polished. This used to be owned by Mr. Matsura. He was head of the association for about 20 years. Does it fit that definition of shibui? Yeah, I think so. Okay. Yes.
Well, Renee said she thought it would look better in a suibon.
Oh, you could, for sure. The difficulty is that you don't often put highly reflective stones in a suibon because the sand typically represents water. That's why Suiseki is water stone, right? I've done it because now I own this stone, but it's a personal choice. Yeah. Not for you, if that's what it looks like for you. How would we see this in nature? Just go to Black Butte and look at one of the buttes, flat on the top with a shelf coming down. By the way, this stone is only about 8 centimeters wide. It's only about this wide. Very expressive, though.
Do you have any like pictures of the one stone displayed like in a suibon and on a to see the difference in how that affects the stone?
If you guys end up, I can, if I get email addresses, it'll be a gift to you. I'll send you a digital copy of my latest book. It's about 200 pages of Suiseki stories. So it goes beyond just the picture. It describes what the person sees in the stone, why it's important to them. It's a big download. It's 120 megs, but WeTransfer will just load it to your iPad or your phone or your desktop computer. Yeah, I've got some cards that you can just scan and buy them from Lulu, but the digital is free. Okay, let's go next. I think we're too far down. 51. I guess I changed the slide after I sent it. Okay, wabi sabi, probably the most heard Japanese aesthetic, which me included, most of us don't have a clue what it means, right? But we describe it as wabi sabi. But it is the most conspicuous and characteristic feature of what we think of as traditional Japanese beauty. Wabi reaches its peak of austerity and emptiness. So how do we define emptiness in a Suiseki display? You talked about it earlier. Negative space. Absolutely. How do you, what in nature gives you a sense of emptiness? Have you ever been where there's nothing but a forest of trees and you're up high where you can look at it and it just looks like it's a repetition? That's emptiness, for example. Okay. There's a definition in this article or essay by Kinko: to long for the moon while looking on the rain, to lower the blinds and be unaware of the passing of the spring. These are even more deeply moving. Branches about to blossom or gardens strewn with faded flowers are worthy of our imagination. Now, what do we like in the US, in a Western aesthetic? Boom, right? We want to see all the cherry blossoms. We want to see all the flowers. But in the Japanese aesthetic, what they really appreciate is seeing the cherry blossoms have fallen. Why is that? What does that convey? Or the lack thereof? Impermanence, right? Yeah. We don't, in our culture, we don't like to talk about death very much. But wabi-sabi is full of death. Flowers dying, right? Cherry blossoms falling. And what they're saying is there is absolute beauty in that, as well as when it's on the cherry tree before it falls. Okay? So here's two examples. One is a little difficult to see. It's the tree example. This is a very famous stone garden. Is that a feeling of emptiness in that stone garden? Why? A lot of empty space, right? Positioning of the stones, the one thing about this garden is that no matter where you are in the garden, you cannot see every stone that's in the garden. There's always one that can't be seen. That was on purpose. But think about now, if you wanted to create this feeling of emptiness, what could you do from a display perspective? Something worth thinking about. Okay? So things wabi-sabi are expressions of time frozen. They're made of materials that are visibly vulnerable to the effects of weathering and human treatment. So are stones impervious to that? Or can they be weathered? Yeah, absolutely, right? So wabi-sabi, as they record the sun, wind, rain, heat, and cold in the language of discoloration, rust, tarnish, stain, warping, shrinking, shriveling, and cracking. This is the other thing that we tend not to like. If you find a stone that's been chipped, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends when it was chipped. If it's a fresh chip, it almost always disqualifies it. Why? Because it stands out. It doesn't harmonize with the rest of the stone. But what if it, which by the way, this stone was broken many years ago. You can see it. But why is it okay now? It's aged. Weather, rain, being in a river, being in the sun has harmonized that break with the rest of the stone. Okay? So, other qualities, irregular, intimate. Now you think about a stone. Can a stone be intimate? Sure it can. Is this stone intimate? This one. We've talked about it being powerful, right? It's got a lot of texture, but can it be intimate at the same time? It does. That's a key word for intimacy, is being drawn in, right? So yeah, absolutely. Want to get to a breaking point soon? Okay, I think we'll do a couple more. So other qualities, unpretentious, earthy, murky, simple. Those are characteristics of wabi-sabi. We're going to move along pretty rapidly now. So it says the closest English word to wabi-sabi is rustic, but this is limited. Originally, the Japanese word for sabi meant chill, lean, or withered, whereas wabi originally meant the misery of living alone in nature. That was a term where when people were sent away by the emperor or the shogunate, they were having to leave or they would be killed. Where did they go? They sent them out into the forest by themselves. They became a hermit. That's where that term also derived from. So the values of wabi-sabi are, it has to be give you a feeling of being impermanent, imperfect, and incomplete. Okay?
If I can make a comment.
Yes.
Several of us went to Japan in February, and one of the things I realized how much the Japanese appreciate old.
Yes.
There's trees that are just decrepit with one live branch, and they have it held up, and
Yep.
and I think here we would have ripped it out and tried to replace it. And so old is valued.
The same thing with kintsugi. Taking a broken pot and putting it back together again. They don't just throw it away. They also appreciate older people, which in our culture doesn't exist. Okay. Let's go. No, back one, sorry. So we're just going to hit this top line. Wabi-sabi represents the exact opposite of the Western ideal of beauty as something monumental, spectacular, and enduring. So would the Super Bowl halftime show be wabi-sabi? No. So let's look at this next stone. Is this wabi or sabi? Well, what do you see, first of all? What does it represent to you? Okay, cave. What else? What else could it be? Okay. Go to a Japanese aesthetic. What does it look like? That would be the right answer, yes. It looks like a thatched hut or hut stone, except this is natural and one of the very best. But it represents wabi, right? In fact, Wil, when he wrote the caption on this, says, with a fine patina of age that comes out of the hardest of stones from the, I can't read it. Yeah, the Kamigawa. Thank you so much. This is the ultimate rustic Kazuya stone, which is our hut stone, in the wabi spirit. The naturally shaped roof and supports have exceptional character. Yeah, it's a fantastic stone. Let me read this one thing and then we'll take a break. Okay. So one of my favorite books is the Book of Tea. What does the Book of Tea have to do with Suiseki? I do a plug. Go to my blog, and I've written about 9 pages on this topic. There's a really tight connection between tea and Suiseki. So this was written in the 16th century. The morning glory was as yet a rare plant. Rikyu, who was one of the original tea masters in Japan, had an entire garden planted with it, which he cultivated with, and I can't pronounce this, assiduous care. The fame of his convoluvi, which is the morning glory, reached the ear of the taiko, and he expressed a desire to see them. This was not a guy you wanted to disappoint, because he could take your head. And he expressed a desire to see them, in consequence of which Rikyu invited him to a morning tea at his home. On the appointed day, he walked through the garden, but nowhere could he see any vestige of the morning glory. How do you think he's feeling by this point? The ground had been leveled and strewn with fine pebbles and sand. With sullen anger, the despot entered the tea room, but a sight waited him there for which completely restored his sense of humor. On the tokonoma, in a rare bronze of Sung workmanship from China, lay a single morning glory, the queen of the entire garden. So what point was this tea master making? So this guy was, the guy that was coming, right, Teiko, was extraordinarily wealthy, had almost unlimited power. So something for him to see, what should he be seeing? Because it's rare, he wants to see a lot of them, right? He wants to see hundreds and hundreds of them, but he shows up and there are none. What's the tea master teaching this fellow? Impermanence, wonderful. Appreciation, yeah. So why just a single one? Rarity, yeah. So one of the most difficult things for me in shows, and this is any show, are the stones are too close together. Have you been to Kokofu? I can't even make it through the entire show without having to leave, because there's just tree after tree after tree after tree, right? And so in the same way with stones, they need separation, because otherwise they're overwhelming. And you really can appreciate, and I can imagine, he did probably laugh out loud when he had an expectation of all of these morning glories. Then he gets angry because there are none, but then he's taken into a tea room, and what's there? The very best of all of them for him to enjoy. That was a good story. All right, break. Okay. There we go. This particular one is called Yujin. And again, it's an important concept in traditional Japanese aesthetic. And Yujin suggests that which is beyond what can be said, but it is not an allusion to another world. It's about this world, this experience. So they give an example: to watch the sun sink behind a flower-clad hill, to wander on in a huge forest without thought of return, to stand upon the shore and gaze after a boat that disappears behind distant islands, or to contemplate the flight of wild geese as seen and lost among the clouds. Let's go to the next page. So here's 2 examples of Yugen. So what do you see in these 2 photographs? What's similar, even though it's radically different subjects? Nature, okay, good. What else? Okay. How about it's transient? You see the geese only for a moment, then it's gone, right? But you have this memory of the geese. What about the scene of the bamboo? What's transient in that photograph? The shadow. Exactly correct. Yes. Let's go to the next slide. So, what is it about this stone? I'll read you the caption. It says, 2 chrysanthemum flowers bloom, cradled by the sturdy base material that surrounds them. Well balanced, this stone not only presents flowers, but also has a simple elegance from which the spirit of Yu-Jin emerges. So, how would Americans see this stone? Well, what kind of stone is it? So, what's missing? Yeah, in fact, that 2 flowers, the flower is gone. The matrix that made up the flower is completely gone. It's only what was holding it in place is left behind. So how does that relate to like seeing the geese? That's exactly right. So there can be beauty even in the absence of the flower. Because what does it do with your imagination? It reminds you that there was a flower there. Now your mind can put that flower back in place. Right? So it's a really good example. This was in the show in Japan a few years ago. Let's just move to page 70. Okay, this should be easy. What is this? What do we think it represents? A beast? Okay. What else? It's a hut. Why Yu-Jin? Why faded? It's exactly right. If you've seen an old hut in the Japanese forest, what tends to happen to the straw thatch? It begins to collapse, right? Part of the building falls down. It's occupied by animals. Those are the kind of things you can think about when you see a stone like this. And this is natural. It's not carved. Okay, what about this next? Excuse me. So what does this represent? A river? Okay. Melting snow? Okay, what else? Say it again. A waterfall? Okay. What else? A glacier? What about a coastal stone? So this is the wave is hit. Now the water is pouring down. Right? So the snow example, water, waterfall, all of those are showing Yu-Jin from it's transitory. It's there for a moment and then gone. Okay. It's a great feeling. All right, our last topic for tonight, then, besides looking at a few stones, is called mono no aware. So it's complex and it's changed over time, but it basically refers to a pathos of things deriving from their transience. That's a common word in Japanese aesthetic for Suiseki, right? Things that are here for a little while. It's a part of wabi-sabi. He gives an example. The sound of the Jian soja bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The color of the sola flowers reveal the truth that the prosperous must decline. The cherry trees would fit into this, right? But at what point in their existence? Peak bloom? No, right? But seeing them falling on the ground? Definitely. So, do we enjoy being on a river trying to collect stones with the knowledge that the river is in a constant state of flux? So, how many of you fly fish or fish? Fly fish in particular. So, what is it about fly fishing that you like?
Hard to say.
Okay.
It's the feeling that it gives me being on the river and you like feeling the river, feeling, knowing where the fish are, being able to cast to them.
Okay.
And it's just a peaceful, tranquil, when you're fly fishing, the world, none of the rest of the world exists. It's you, the river, and that's it.
So one of the reasons that I like to collect in early spring, anybody want to guess? Because the river has turned stones over. And to me, suiseki or tanseki is a lot like fly fishing. You have no clue what you're going to get. The more informed you are in terms of where fish can hide or the rivers to go to will improve your chances. But there's something about the hunt of going out on a river or going to the Green Club in Japan and seeing what you can find, because that's a hunt as well, right? But there's something about that because it is only for a moment. I mean, even my longest tanseki is 4 days. 4 days isn't a long time to find a lot of stones. But it's the excitement of going, the unknown, but trying to be educated about what I'm looking for, okay? And as I stated, it sort of excites us because of the endless possibilities of what it might present at our feet. So here's 2 examples of mono-aware or miyabi. Example I've used over and over with the cherry blossoms. But also, what do we see on the left? Fallen leaves, right? How many of you really enjoy taking a walk in the fall? Why? What is it about the fall that you enjoy? Color. Change in color, yeah. Yeah, isn't it also a feeling that things are changing? We're going from spring to summer or from summer to fall, etc., right? Okay. So we're not going to do the moss thing tonight because I want to save a little time for your stuff, but I want to show you 3 stones and I want you to think about them from a classification perspective, but then also think about them from a Japanese aesthetic. I've got 2 daizas for this I was showing to Kirk a minute ago, that you can build boxes that will hold 2 daizas, which is kind of a nice feature. Thank you for turning the light on. Okay. The stone I acquired it from Robert or McKenzie. Most of you guys know him. All right, so what do we think classification-wise? Mountain stone, okay. What else? Color? Color? You can turn the lights back on again. Oh, sorry, because you can't see the screen. So we have greens, almost black, right? Is it smooth, textured? The distant mountain, excellent. It's not a very big stone, is it? But very expressive. My buddy Will, the guy from Japan, said this stone could be on the cover of any Suiseki book in Japan. Bob did a good job of finding these stones, right? Would you display this in a suiban? Would you? Yeah. So it's a little shiny, right? So I think it would be a personal choice. I've never shown it that way. I've always shown it in a daiza. Okay? All right. Now, Japanese aesthetic, while I'm getting the next stone out, what do you see? Okay, the miyabi. Yep. All right, what else? Do you see wabi-sabi in this stone at all? Not so much, right? It doesn't look ancient to me. right? Is it quiet or busy? Quiet? Okay. So if it's quiet, is it as quiet as this stone? So this stone is the Kitakama River in Japan. This is a very quiet stone, even more so than this. But what makes it quiet? Why you can guess why I think it's quieter than this stone. Okay. Okay. Ah, good. Good definition so far. Much more subtle, right? It doesn't have sharp edges at all, other than what looks like a break from a very long time ago. This is a very old stone. Does this stone have wabi-sabi as compared to this stone? I think so too, right? But is it elegant? I think this is more elegant than this stone, right? But see, how would I picture this stone? What would I picture it around or with to sort of create that imaginative completion? Okay. This could have been a really good bonsai in a tray with sand to make it look like water. The other thing you could do is put a small tenpai with it. Could be a bird, which would make the stone look a lot smaller, or it could be a little hut, little bronze hut, which might make it look much bigger than it actually is. So when you think of display, you've got a lot of control of the mental image that you can provide to people who are viewing your stones. Okay? Now, this next stone it's interesting because there's a bit of dichotomy in that it's probably the quietest stone, but the most complex. Does it sound at odds? It is at odds, but you'll see what I mean. I want to talk a little bit about this Daisa as well. Okay. So what do you see? Okay. That's actually yellow. Very much. Mysterious. Okay. Good. I like your imagination. Think about it from the mimetic aesthetic of Japan. What might they see? Yes. In fact, Will and I named the stone Hazy Sun. If you've ever been out on a river early in the morning collecting, where there's a lot of haze, what does it often do to the sun? It almost blocks it out. So you see this sort of, you don't see a circle. What you see is this sort of irregular object, but it is the sun coming through the fog or the early morning clouds. So simple, very quiet, but to me at the same time, it's very complex. Now, the Daisas for all of these, except this was Robert's, were made by Harada, who is today still the best Daisa maker in Japan. And Will and I spent about 2.5 months trying to figure out how to build a Daisa for this stone. So let's spend the last minute or two of my discussion. Why? Why do we spend so much time? Stony Creek here in California. Yep. It's mainly white quartz. I have no idea what the yellow inclusion is unless it's magnesium. but I don't know. So what's different about this daisen? Okay. It's elevated. Why would we elevate it? Yeah, so the haze in the morning sky is often just above ground level, right? Especially if there's a lot of moisture in the air. So we wanted to give a sense of lifting up. We wanted you to look up rather than this. Would you want a stone like this to be in a daisa like that? Oh, heavens, no, because you would lose this feeling of solidness. So it was very important that this get lifted up, but in a way that doesn't distract from the overall view of this being a hazy, sunny morning. Yes. Is this? It's just a little off, which is, that was on purpose. Yeah. Again, Americans and their aesthetic love things that are centered. The Japanese do not. They want it to be a little bit off. It's the same thing in the Fibonacci sequence, right? So you have something, you want it to be a little bit to the side. You tend to do it in movement. So if this were going to go into a suiban, I wouldn't place this in the middle of the suiban. Why? It's just like with bonsai. Where do you want it placed in a tokonoma? You want to place it where it flows. So this stone flows to me this direction. So it'd have less room on this side, more room on this side from a negative space perspective. So we were accomplishing two things, sort of listening to that rule of it not being dead center, but also lifting it up in terms of trying to reveal that this is sky. Okay. Which is similar to the long stone and the white quartz, right? They were trying to show you it's clouds. So what you want to think about also is my last comment when you're displaying is what kind of visual cues can you give to your audience? It doesn't mean you're interpreting for them. They're going to let their imagination flow, but you can still provide visual clues to try to give them an idea of what you as the owner or the displayer see. The School of Kaido has an excellent book. It's in English and Japanese. It's about 175 pages. It's not a cheap book. It's about $140 with shipping. But it will give you examples of trees and stones displayed in tokonomas with objects. So it will show you, and everything is seasonal. So if you're in the winter, your scroll has to represent that season. You can't do a spring scroll in December. But it's really fantastic for showing you small objects like tenpai or little bronze rabbits maybe, along with scrolls or a painting. Yep. Yes.
Or are they treated in any way, or are they just cleaned up and?
So these three, nothing's touched them. It doesn't say that I haven't touched it, other stones. Yeah. But these three are just the way they were. Yeah.
Is there any significance to the boxes, the carrying of them?
So, you know, Japan, they put everything in a box. From jewelry to glassware to stones to tables to whatever it is. I personally like boxes for a couple of reasons. One, it's safety. I can move these around, I can stack them on top. But the other thing is provenance. So this stone, this Japanese writing is talking about the river it was found in. This was found in Washington State. It's the name of the stone, and then who made the daisa. Now I have other stones which I didn't bring where it's not only filled in here, but on the back, it's full of Japanese writing. And it's providing the historical context and provenance of the stone itself. But even if you don't do the writing, Just having it in a high quality box just protects things. I know Jerry Braswell makes them. You can make them yourself. It's not that difficult. And in fact, all of this wood, it's very high quality Royal Paulownia wood that Japan uses, comes from the US. Isn't that weird? The US, from the East Coast, because we have very, very fine grain wood. So yeah, make boxes. Other questions? Yes.
Is there any consideration to the geologic birth of some of these stones in terms of, you know, how they were made? Because there's definitely like the one with the black rock with the white line through it, and you know, and the colorful ones that have gone through. Is there in the classifications? Is that considered?
Not really. But there's a reason. Think about that. So river is normally mentioned because people want to know where it came from. But I only know of one set of Suiseki books that talks about the geology of the stone. It's called Suiseki 1 and Suiseki 2, and it's written by this guy, I can never pronounce his name, but it's like Nuijin. It's his dad collected these stones. Some of them were from the Iwasaki family, very famous family in Japan, who collected these incredible stones. He talks about geology. Why do you think that is? He was a geologist. But out of all the hundreds of books that I have, geology is almost never mentioned. But think about it. Do you care? Some people do, but most people don't. Yes. Fairly diverse. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in fact, I'll close with this story. The guy who publishes Aiseki magazine in Japan came to the US, and we took him to the Eel River. He only had 4 hours to collect. And so Tahara-san, I walked up, and around him was about 15 stones in a circle. And he was standing dead center of the circle. I said, Tahara-san, what are you doing? He says, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I've always wondered what it would have been like to have been collecting in Japan during the stone boom of the 1960s and 70s. He said, finally, I know. Because he had collected 15 stones he would have taken home in 4 hours. He couldn't take them all, he took 3. But we talk about these rivers as if they've been emptied out. Have you ever heard that when you go to the Eel? Oh, you're not going to find anything. It's been over collected. Boulder Dash, there are 2 million stones in those stone fields. You just got to slow down and look. Anyway, thank you all for coming.